Imagine you meet someone. They're charming, funny, easy to talk to. Then you find out they're worth $3 billion. Your brain does something weird. It starts rewriting the entire relationship before you've even ordered dessert. Marrying a billionaire isn't like marrying someone rich. It's not even close. The gap between wealthy and billionaire is so vast that most of what you think you know stops applying. Today, we're walking through what actually happens when you marry into that world. The paperwork, the lawyers, the quiet control, and the part where your life stops being entirely yours. Let's be honest about what this really looks like. Most people propose with a ring and a nervous speech. Billionaires propose with a ring, a nervous speech, and a legal team on standby. Before the wedding happens, there's a document you're going to see, the prenuptial agreement, and not the simple one-pager your mate's cousin signed. We're talking about documents that run 40, 50, sometimes over 100 pages. These aren't just about if we split, you get this much. They map out every financial scenario, what you get if the marriage lasts 2 years, 5 years, 10. What happens if there are children? What happens if there aren't? What you're entitled to if they cheat? What you're entitled to if you cheat? Some of these agreements include non-disclosure clauses that survive the marriage itself. You could be divorced for a decade and still legally barred from talking about what you saw. Here's the bit that surprises people. You don't negotiate this document with your partner, you negotiate it with their legal team, and they're very good at their job. You'll need your own lawyer, a specialist, not your family solicitor, and even then you're walking into a room where the other side has spent months preparing. You're outgunned. You're in love. They're protecting a fortune that predates you and will outlast you. And here's the uncomfortable truth. If you don't sign, the wedding doesn't happen. Full stop. It's not romantic, but it is the entry price. You get married. Congratulations. Now let's talk about what your money means. Before, you had a job, a salary, maybe some savings. That was your financial identity. Now, that entire category gets quietly reclassified. You're not broke. You probably have access to more money than you've ever seen, but it's not yours in the way you understood that word. Most billionaire families don't operate like normal households. There isn't a joint account where you both chuck in your pay. Instead, there's a structure. The wealth sits in trusts, investment vehicles, holding companies. You might get an allowance. And yes, that word gets used. Allowance. It could be $50,000 a month, $100,000 more. Enough that complaining feels absurd. But here's the thing. It's still an allowance. You're not earning it. You don't control the amount. Someone else decided that number and someone else can change it. If you kept your job, that income starts to feel strange. You're earning, let's say, $80,000 a year, roughly what a teacher makes, while living in a house worth more than 500 teachers will earn in their entire careers combined. Your salary becomes symbolic. Some people keep working because it's the one part of their financial life they still control. Others stop because what's the point? Either way, you've stepped into a world where your financial autonomy quietly evaporated and everyone's pretending it didn't. And then there's the spending. You'd think unlimited money means unlimited freedom. It doesn't. Every major purchase gets noticed, not because you can't afford it, you obviously can, but because wealth at this level is managed, monitored, tracked. You're not buying a car. You're making a decision that 3 accountants will see and possibly question. The freedom you imagined, it comes with a permanent audience. And that audience is about to get a lot more invasive. Here's what nobody tells you about marrying into serious wealth. You're joining a system that was built long before you showed up, and it doesn't bend easily. The houses were chosen, the staff were hired, the routines were set, the social calendar was locked in. You're not building a life together from scratch. You're moving into someone else's life and finding a spot. Take the homes. You probably won't live in just one place. There's the primary residence, the place in the mountains, the beach house, maybe a flat in another city. You don't get to pick these. They were purchased years ago, decorated by someone else, staffed by people who've worked for the family longer than you've been around. You're the newcomer. The chef has been there 8 years, the estate manager 12. They're polite, professional, and utterly loyal. To the family, not to you. Then there's the social world. Billionaire social circles aren't like your friendships, they're networks. There are obligations, charity galas, fundraisers, dinner parties with people you don't particularly like but who matter to the family's interests. You'll meet other spouses in your position, and if you're lucky, one of them will quietly explain the rules no one says out loud. Who you're supposed to be nice to, which events you can skip, which ones you can't, your own friends. That gets complicated. Not because anyone's cruel about it, but because the gap becomes obvious. You suggest drinks at a pub and it feels strange now. You're living in a different world and pretending you're not gets exhausting for everyone. Some of your friendships will survive. A lot won't. It's one of those quiet losses nobody warns you about. Honestly, this is the part that makes me most uncomfortable, not the money control, but the way it's packaged as care. Let's talk about control. Not the dramatic villainous kind, the bureaucratic kind, the kind that's justified as protection or privacy or for your own good, and sometimes it genuinely is, but it's still control. You'll have security. Depending on the family's profile, that could mean a driver who's also a bodyguard, cameras everywhere, background checks on new people in your life. You might need to clear your travel plans in advance, not because your spouse is possessive, though maybe they are, but because there's a whole security apparatus that needs to know where you'll be. Spontaneity becomes a logistical problem. Then there's the public image. If your partner's wealth is visible, and at the billionaire level it usually is, you become part of the brand, whether you wanted to or not. The family might have a PR team. They'll have opinions about your social media, what you post, what you don't. Some families ask spouses to sign off on public statements. Others are more relaxed, but you're never quite off duty. And here's the bit that bothers people most. The exit is complicated. Remember that prenup? It wasn't just about money. It was about control. If you leave on terms that were decided before you ever walked down the aisle. You might be financially comfortable after a divorce, but you won't be free in the way you were before you met them. The NDA follows you. The settlement terms follow you. You're not just walking away from a marriage, you're extracting yourself from a legal structure that was designed to make extraction difficult. If you have kids, this is where it gets even more layered. Your children aren't just your children, they're heirs. They're the next generation of the family wealth. And that means their lives get planned in ways most parents never deal with. There's the education. It's not just private school. It's the right private school, the one that feeds into the right university, which connects to the right network. Their friends get quietly vetted. Not obviously, no one's running background checks on 8-year-olds, but families are noticed, assessed, sorted. Then there's the money itself. You might assume your kids will inherit a fortune. Maybe they will, but maybe they won't, at least not directly. A lot of billionaire families use trusts that release funds at certain ages or under certain conditions. Your children could be worth hundreds of millions on paper and not be able to touch a cent until they're 35 or 40. The family decides, not you. And here's the part that creates the most tension. You and your spouse might have very different ideas about how to raise them. You might want them to have a normal childhood. Good luck with that when normal isn't an option. They'll grow up in houses with staff. They'll travel by private plane. Their birthday parties will have security. You can try to keep them grounded, and plenty of parents do, but the gap between their life and the life you grew up in is so enormous that normal becomes a performance. Some families handle this well, others don't. But either way, you're raising children who will inherit not just money, but expectations, scrutiny, and a set of problems most people never have to think about. So let's be honest about what marrying a billionaire actually means. It's not the fantasy. It's not rags to riches. You gain access to a level of material comfort most people will never see, and you lose a degree of autonomy most people take for granted. You don't get to build a life from scratch. You step into one that was designed before you arrived, and you adjust. The lawyers come first. The structure comes next. Your old life becomes something you used to have. Does that mean it's a bad deal? Not necessarily. Some people thrive in that world. Others find it suffocating. But what it definitely isn't is simple. The wealth doesn't erase complexity. It adds layers of it, and the version you see in films or read in profiles. That's the edited version. The real thing is quieter, stranger, and far more controlled than most people imagine. If this pulled back the curtain on something you'd only ever guessed at, there's more where that came from. Hit subscribe. We're mapping out how money and power actually work, one reality check at a time. That's money, actually.